It was the kind of late summer Saturday where the sun hung lower, softer, and the trees held on to the last of their green before fading into gold. The town of Belden, Vermont was slow that morning, quiet in a way that felt comforting and familiar. On that day, Jonah Mills, just 6 years old, vanished. He had been in the backyard while his sister Elsie did homework at the kitchen table. Their mother, Sarah, was folding laundry upstairs. It was the kind of setup any family might consider safe. The yard was fenced. The dog Pepper was inside. There had never been any reason to be afraid. But by noon, Jonah was gone. At first, Sarah thought he had wandered into the garage, then maybe into the neighbor's yard. But when she called out and no small voice replied, panic set in like a wave. Jonah was not the kind of child who wandered far. He was cautious, curious, but careful, and never went anywhere without his stuffed raccoon, which still lay on the porch steps undisturbed. The local police arrived within the hour. Officers combed the property and called in volunteers. People from the neighborhood who had known Jonah since birth came running with flashlights and thermoses of coffee prepared to search the woods well into the night. It did not feel real. It felt like a mistake. As the sun dipped behind the hills, casting long shadows across the trees, Sarah sat on the porch swing, her hands trembling, her eyes fixed on the tree line. There was no sign of a break-in, no footprints leading out, no tire marks on the road. Just Jonah's last footsteps, small and scattered in the soft soil, fading near the fence. A search dog caught a faint scent, but it vanished at the road's edge, as if he had evaporated. The officers told Sarah not to assume the worst, but their eyes could not hide the truth. They had seen this before, and it rarely ended well. By morning, the Mills house had become the center of a desperate operation. Reporters stood at the edge of the driveway. Helicopters hovered overhead. But there was still no trace of Jonah. The backyard had been combed clean, every inch examined, every bush shaken. Nothing. Sarah gave the police every detail she could remember. Jonah's pajamas were still upstairs on his bed. He had been wearing his red sneakers, navy shorts, and a t-shirt with a cartoon owl. She remembered packing him a juice box for later, something he never left behind unless he had meant to return soon. The lack of struggle, the untouched surroundings, and the eerie quiet led detectives to one awful possibility. Jonah had not run away. Someone had taken him. But who could have gotten so close so quickly without a sound, and why? In the days that followed, Sarah barely slept. She replayed every memory, every moment, as if one of them might hold the answer. She remembered a man at the grocery store who had smiled too long at Jonah. She recalled a delivery van that had slowed on their street a few weeks earlier. All of it blurred together under the weight of fear. Elsie stopped eating. She stayed in her room with the blinds drawn, her headphones on all day. She refused to talk about her brother, but she left the light on in the hallway at night. Sarah noticed. It was something Jonah had been afraid of. The dark. Even if he was not home, she kept the hallway light on too, just in case he found his way back. By the end of the first week, tips had slowed. Flyers were posted in every gas station across the county. Sarah recorded a video plea for help that aired on local news. Her voice cracked, her hands trembled, but her words were clear. Bring him home, please, no questions. Just bring him back. Her husband, Mark, who had been away on a business trip the day Jonah disappeared, returned immediately, but the tension between them grew. He blamed himself for being gone. She blamed herself for not watching closer. They were living in the same house, but miles apart, each haunted by different shadows. Every knock at the door felt like a potential answer, but none ever were. On the 10th day, a false lead nearly broke them. A boy was spotted in Albany who matched Jonah's description. The Mills drove 3 hours in silence, hope clinging to every second. But when they arrived, it was not him. The child's name was Caleb. He had wandered from his foster home. His clothes were different, his voice was wrong. But for a moment Sarah had believed. She had seen Jonah in that child's eyes. On the drive home she did not speak. She pressed her forehead to the window and watched the highway blur into nothing. That night, as rain tapped softly against the windows, she sat in Jonah's room for the first time since he vanished. She touched the books on his shelf. She picked up his raccoon, and as she sat there, knees pulled to her chest, she whispered words into the darkness that no mother should ever have to say. She told him she was sorry, that she should have protected him, and then she begged, not to heaven, not to a god, but to anyone, anything listening, "Please, just bring my son back." The second week brought colder mornings and colder truths. The flyers began to curl at the edges, weathered by spring rains and wind. People still called, still asked if there were any updates, but the urgency in their voices had faded. For the detectives assigned to the case, routine replaced hope. They began compiling profiles, printing out schedules, creating timelines that stretched across whiteboards and cork panels. Sarah stayed close to the house, answering every knock, every phone call, every question, as though it might be the one that mattered. Mark grew distant. He spent long hours in the basement staring at old family photos, organizing receipts and bills as if control over the little things might help him make sense of the big one. Neither parent noticed the silence growing in Elsie. She no longer listened to music. She sat in Jonah's room, not touching anything, just staring. The house became a monument to a life interrupted, where every small detail felt sacred and dangerous at the same time. When Detective Lee returned for follow-up interviews, he brought a small notebook and a new question that unsettled Sarah completely. Had she seen any unfamiliar people in the neighborhood that week? Sarah remembered someone. A man in a Navy maintenance uniform walking along the side of the house that Monday, 2 days before Jonah went missing. She had assumed he was with the city, maybe checking a water meter or trimming a public tree. She had not thought much of it at the time, but when the police followed up with the local utility companies, none of them had sent anyone to the neighborhood that day. No workers were scheduled. No vans had been logged. The description was vague. The man had a beard and wore a dark baseball cap. His face did not stand out, but the uniform had a patch on the sleeve, something she could not read from the window. That detail, small as it seemed, shifted the direction of the case. Officers canvassed nearby homes. One neighbor claimed she saw the same man near the fence line behind the Mills' yard, crouching near the bushes. She thought he had dropped something, maybe keys, but he left quickly when she looked his way. That evening, the search expanded again. The wooded area behind the neighborhood was searched with cadaver dogs and drones. Still, nothing turned up. Another strange discovery unsettled the investigators. Jonah's backpack was found 3 days later, propped neatly against the base of a tree about 70 feet from the back fence. The lunch Sarah had packed was still inside, uneaten. His sketchbook and favorite pencil were untouched. The zipper was closed. There was no dirt, no signs of struggle. It looked placed, not dropped. Detective Lee brought the bag to Sarah in silence. She cried when she touched the zipper. Mark sat on the stairs staring at the floor. To him, it felt like a message. Someone wanted them to know that Jonah had left the yard. But it also felt rehearsed, like someone wanted to control the story being told. Lee asked if Jonah had any reason to go into the woods. Sarah shook her head. Jonah had been scared of tick snakes and especially the dark. There was no way he would have gone in there alone. Elsie, listening from the hallway, said nothing. She had seen something different in the woods that day. A shape, maybe a shadow through the trees. But she did not say anything, not yet. As suspicions grew, so did the scrutiny. People began whispering at church and the grocery store, even among the search volunteers. Some began questioning Mark. He had not been home when Jonah disappeared, but the timing of his return and his withdrawn behavior gave rise to rumors. Mark had argued with Jonah the night before he left for his business trip. It was over a broken vase and a spilled glass of milk. It was ordinary, but in the light of the disappearance, everything became suspicious. The detectives asked him for travel logs, phone records, GPS locations. Mark complied, but he grew increasingly angry. He felt like a suspect in his own tragedy. One night he left without saying anything. Sarah found him hours later parked outside the police station. He had fallen asleep in the car. When she tapped on the window, he looked up at her with the emptiest eyes she had ever seen. He said he just wanted answers, even if they hurt. Meanwhile, Elsie began withdrawing into her drawings again. She had found one of Jonah's old notebooks under his bed. In it were dozens of sketches they had made together. But one page confused her. It showed a man standing in the woods wearing a hat and holding something in his left hand. There was a strange symbol on the man's arm, something like an hourglass or a sideways 8. Jonah had been obsessed with secret codes and treasure maps. He had drawn symbols everywhere. But this one felt different. It was darker, more careful. Elsie traced the image with her finger and tried to remember if she had seen anyone like that before. She began sketching again late at night, often without realizing. Once, Sarah found her asleep on the living room floor with a pencil still in her hand. She had drawn a tree with roots reaching into a dark hole. There was no door, just blackness. Sarah hung the picture on the fridge, not realizing it was the same tree from their backyard. The investigation moved slowly. Without new leads, the police had fewer resources to deploy. Detectives rotated off the case. Volunteers stopped showing up. The story left the news cycle, but inside the Mills household, the grief remained active and raw. Sarah began keeping a journal recording every memory she could of Jonah. His favorite cereal, the way he mispronounced helicopter, how he used to say the moon followed him when they drove at night. Mark returned to work, reluctantly avoiding questions from coworkers. Elsie grew quieter but more observant. She began noticing things, like how Pepper, their dog, still refused to go near the back fence, or how the laundry room door stuck slightly, something it had never done before. These were little things no one else cared about. But to Elsie they felt like clues. Something was missing. Not just Jonah. Something that had slipped past all of them in the panic. And whatever it was, she was determined to find it. By the end of the first month, the story of Jonah Mills had spread beyond Vermont. News trucks lined the street near the Mills home. National outlets aired segments featuring his photo beside pleas from Sarah and Mark. The same clip of Jonah on his 6th birthday played across television screens. He had frosting on his cheek and a crooked smile. It was the kind of image that stirred hearts, the kind of child that looked too loved to simply disappear. But the longer the story stayed in the headlines, the more questions replaced sympathy. A well-known cable host asked bluntly whether the parents were telling the whole truth. Internet forums dissected the case with armchair detectives debating everything from Elsie's silence to Sarah's facial expressions during interviews. One blog even claimed Jonah had been taken by someone close to the family using vague language and misquoted sources. Sarah stopped watching the news. Mark started drinking quietly in the garage, and Elsie stayed inside away from cameras, afraid that the world might see something in her eyes that she had not seen herself. One of the local reporters, a woman named Denise from Channel 5, stayed in close contact with the family. She had covered a similar case in 1989 and believed there were patterns being missed. One afternoon, she brought Sarah a box of photocopied newspaper clippings. It was about a boy named Casey who had vanished from a different Vermont town, also near a wooded area, also without a trace. His case had gone cold quickly and was largely forgotten. Denise had found it while researching missing children in rural counties. The similarities were unsettling. Both boys had been 6. Both had last been seen near the edge of their backyard. and both had been described as quiet, imaginative, and cautious. There had been no physical evidence in that case either. Sarah read the articles carefully, then handed them to Elsie. That night, Elsie placed Casey's photo beside one of Jonah's on her wall. She stared at them both until her eyes blurred. In the third week of the investigation, a woman came forward claiming she had visions of Jonah. She said she could feel his energy, that he was alive but scared. She described a room with yellow walls and a door that never opened. Desperate for any lead, the police allowed her to direct a new search. They followed her instructions to an abandoned property near a swamp 2 counties over. It took an entire day and multiple officers. The team trudged through thick mud and bramble, only to find rotting furniture and a dead raccoon. The tip led nowhere. The woman vanished from public view shortly afterward, but the damage was done. Resources had been wasted. Officers were frustrated. And the Mills family was left feeling more hopeless than before. Sarah had believed, if only for a moment. Elsie had cried the entire ride home, not because she believed the woman, but because the search team had looked exhausted. They looked the way she felt, empty and worn down. Public support began to splinter. Donations to the reward fund dropped. Volunteers stopped coming by. Sarah still handed out flyers at gas stations. She kept a folder in her car, always ready. She had developed a habit of looking at every child she passed, imagining each one as Jonah. Mark refused to participate in any more interviews. He believed the media had turned them into characters in a drama not grieving parents. At work, his colleagues avoided him. No one knew what to say. One evening, he came home to find spray paint on the garage door, the word liar written in shaky red letters. Sarah washed it off before Elsie could see. But she noticed anyway. The town had stopped whispering. Now it judged openly. There were too many unanswered questions, too few clues, and no one left to blame except the people closest to Jonah. Elsie began having dreams. In them, she saw Jonah running through the woods calling for her, but she could never reach him. She kept a notebook on her nightstand and wrote down every detail. Some mornings, the pages were blank. Other mornings, they were filled with drawings. Trees that looked too tall. Doors with locks on the outside. Faces with no eyes. One morning, she woke up holding a sketch she did not remember drawing. It showed the back of their house, the swing set, and a man standing near the tree line. She took the drawing to Sarah, who froze when she saw it. It matched the description of the man in the fake utility uniform. It was not proof, but it was something. They brought the sketch to Detective Lee, who listened carefully but could offer no next steps. Without new evidence or witnesses, there was little he could do. He told them he would keep the drawing on file and promised to follow up if any new reports came in. But even Elsie could hear the resignation in his voice. On the 30th day, the case officially shifted from active to pending. It meant fewer officers, fewer resources, and a lower chance of new leads being followed. Sarah stared at the report for a long time. Elsie sat beside her in silence. Mark did not come home that night. He stayed with his brother in another town. That weekend, the church hosted a candlelight vigil. Dozens of families attended. Jonah's teacher spoke briefly. Elsie lit a candle and placed it in the center of the circle. She whispered a single word before stepping back. Come, she did not expect anyone to hear, but something inside her believed it mattered. That maybe wherever Jonah was, he might feel it. That even if no one else believed anymore, she still did. She always would. By the time 6 months had passed, the Mills family had splintered into quiet corners of their own lives. They still lived under the same roof, but the silence between them had grown thicker than walls. Sarah spent her days volunteering at a nearby shelter, folding clothes and organizing supplies. It gave her structure, something to hold on to. Mark returned to full-time work at the auto body shop, often staying late without explanation. At night, they passed each other in the kitchen without making eye contact. No one spoke about the investigation anymore. The photos of Jonah still hung in the hallway, but they became like wallpaper. They were there, but no one acknowledged them. They had turned into something painful, a reminder of what the house no longer contained. Elsie often felt like a ghost in her own home. She tiptoed through the house as if her presence might disturb the silence her parents had agreed upon. She ate dinner alone most nights, sometimes sitting at Jonah's old seat just to feel like someone else might walk in. The pressure finally broke Sarah. One morning, she left a manila envelope on the dining room table. Inside was a legal separation agreement and a handwritten note. The note was short and apologetic. She said she still loved Mark, but could not bear the weight of pretending they were still a family. Mark did not respond that day. He simply left the envelope untouched and went to work as usual. That night, he slept in the basement. Elsie found the note and read it twice before tearing it into pieces and throwing it away. She felt like a spectator at the end of a play that had run too long. Her parents were exhausted. The grief had exhausted them. It had hollowed out everything they had once built together. There were no more arguments, no yelling, just the steady numb decline of two people who had once loved each other more than anything. Now they simply endured. It was during this emotional unraveling that Elsie began sleepwalking. At first, Sarah thought Elsie had stayed up late. She found her daughter in Jonah's room around 2 a.m, sitting on the bed and holding one of his drawings. When asked why she was there, Elsie looked confused. She had no memory of walking there. A week later, it happened again. This time she was found in the laundry room standing still with her hand on the doorknob. She had drawn something in the dust on top of the washer. It was a shape Sarah recognized from Jonah's sketchbook. A circle with jagged lines through the center. Elsie could not explain it. She was having vivid dreams, often waking up sweating with vague recollections of sounds and images. A creek running, a door creaking, a man's shadow cast against wood. Sarah took her to a doctor who suggested it was trauma-induced. The mind, he said, finds ways to process grief. Sometimes it walks through the dark to find what the conscious mind cannot. Elsie began writing down everything she remembered from her dreams. She kept a notebook beside her bed. The entries were scattered and messy, sometimes only a few words. Other times entire pages filled with fragmented thoughts. Jonah running, a hand with a strange tattoo, a door with 3 locks. One night she dreamt she was following Jonah through a hallway lined with mirrors. Each reflection showed a different version of herself. In one, she was older. In another, she was a child again. She wrote about how she reached for him, but her hand passed through his. She woke up crying. Sarah sat on the edge of her bed and stroked her hair until she fell back asleep. In those quiet moments, they felt like a family again, even if just for a few minutes. Mark never asked about the sleepwalking. He rarely asked about anything anymore. He was present in body but absent in spirit. Grief had made him a shadow. One afternoon, Sarah went into Jonah's room with the intention of packing up his belongings. She lasted 10 minutes. She opened his dresser and saw a pair of socks still folded the way she had taught him. A half-used coloring book rested on the floor. His favorite blanket, the one with dinosaurs, was still tucked under the pillow. She sat on the bed and wept until her chest hurt. Elsie found her there and said nothing. She sat beside her mother and rested her head on her shoulder. In that moment, no words were needed. They both knew what the other felt. Mark came home late that night. He walked past the room without looking inside. The house was quiet again, but not peaceful. It was the silence of people learning how to live with a wound that would never close. A silence that echoed down the halls and settled into the bones of the house. Elsie began spending more time at the library. She read books about memory trauma and missing persons. She collected newspaper clippings and old maps of the area. She became obsessed with the wooded trail behind their house. It had been searched many times, but something kept pulling her attention back to it. She walked it every Sunday, noting every tree, every bend in the path, every unusual rock or stump. One day she found a metal object partially buried near the edge of the trail. It was rusted and small, like a latch or hook. It could have belonged to anything, but it felt significant. She took a photo and added it to her journal. Later that night, she had a dream of Jonah drawing in the dirt with a stick the same shape she had seen in the dust on the washer. When she woke up, she drew it again. It was the same. Every line matched. 2 years after Jonah's disappearance, the Mills home looked nearly the same on the outside, but inside time had carved deep and invisible scars. Sarah still lived there, though most of the rooms remained untouched. Jonah's door stayed closed. Mark had moved into a small apartment above the auto shop. He and Sarah spoke only when necessary, mostly through short phone calls. Elsie had graduated from high school and enrolled in a local community college studying early childhood education. She still walked the trail behind their old house whenever she visited Sarah on weekends. The trees had changed over time. Some had fallen during storms. Others had grown taller, but the silence in the woods remained. Elsie sometimes brought her journal, marking small details on each trip. She found discarded wrappers, an old camping knife, even a broken compass. She collected these items in a shoebox she kept under her bed. None of them connected to Jonah directly, but she refused to throw anything away. Every object felt like a possibility, something that might lead to the truth. Sarah began clearing out the garage one spring afternoon. The shelves had collected years of forgotten things. Old holiday decorations, dusty tools boxes from Mark's old office. In the far corner, covered with a blue tarp, she found a stack of plastic bins. Inside one of them were school projects, photo albums, and drawings. It was a mix of Elsie's early paintings and Jonah's clumsy scribbles. One folder was labeled with Jonah's name in Sarah's handwriting. She opened it slowly and found a stack of sketches. Some were familiar. Others she had never seen. One caught her attention immediately. It showed a house with a tree in the yard, and near the base of the tree a door drawn into the roots. The details were eerie. The house looked almost identical to theirs, but not quite. The windows were shaped differently, and the chimney leaned slightly. She placed the drawing aside and continued looking through the folder, but her mind kept returning to that one image. That night, she gave the drawing to Elsie. Elsie stared at it for several minutes. She had seen the same door in her dreams. The jagged lines around it were identical to the ones she had traced in the dust and sketched in her journal. She turned the paper over. There was no date, no signature. Just a smudge in the corner where Jonah had pressed too hard with a crayon. She asked Sarah if Jonah had ever mentioned the drawing. Sarah could not remember. Elsie took the paper back to her apartment and placed it on her desk beside the other drawings she had collected over the years. Later that week, she received a letter in the mail with no return address. Inside was a photocopy of another drawing. It was the same style as Jonah's, drawn in pencil on lined paper. The sketch showed a man sitting on a bench, his left hand resting on his knee. There was a small tattoo on the back of that hand, a broken hourglass. Elsie felt her stomach drop. She called Sarah immediately, asking if Jonah had ever mentioned someone with a tattoo. Sarah paused, then said that once, shortly before he disappeared, Jonah had pointed at a man on the sidewalk and asked why his hand was cracked. She had dismissed it as childish imagination, but now the memory felt loaded. Elsie returned to the sketch from the garage. She noticed the man's arm, partially visible behind the tree, had a mark in the same spot. It was not detailed, but it was enough to stir something inside her. She placed the two images side by side. They matched. She checked the envelope again. There was no postmark. It had likely been delivered by hand. That detail unsettled her. Someone knew where she lived. Someone wanted her to find this. She placed the drawing in a plastic sleeve and added it to the binder she had begun compiling over the years. The collection had grown thick, each page filled with theories, maps, and sketches. Most were guesses. A few were dreams, but some, like this one, felt real. Later that month, Sarah decided to leave the house. The memories had become too heavy. She packed only what she needed and put the rest in storage. Elsie helped her rent a small apartment near downtown Providence. It was quiet, modest, and full of sunlight. Sarah tried to settle into a new rhythm, but she often sat by the window for hours staring at nothing. Elsie offered to help organize the storage unit they had rented near the outskirts of town. It was packed floor to ceiling with boxes from the old house. She sorted them, slowly labeling each one. One of the boxes contained a sealed envelope marked with the year 2009. Inside were photos receipts and a birthday card addressed to Jonah from a distant cousin. But at the bottom of the envelope, folded neatly, was a drawing she had never seen before. It was simple, a child's pencil sketch of a room with one chair, one window, and no door. On the wall, a clock with no hands. In the bottom corner, Jonah had written 3 words. Do not forget. Elsie sat in the storage unit for nearly an hour. The light overhead flickered softly. She held the drawing in her lap and tried to make sense of it. The message felt intentional. She flipped through her journal and found another dream entry from the previous year. It described a room with no doors, just one window and a chair. She had drawn a clock on the wall. It had no hands. The similarities chilled her. She called Sarah and asked if she remembered Jonah drawing anything like that before. Sarah said she might have seen something similar once but could not be sure. Elsie made a copy of the drawing and pinned it to the corkboard above her desk. She stared at it each night, willing it to give her more. She began walking different parts of town, visiting places from their past, hoping something would click. In a small diner near the old school, she spotted a man who looked familiar. He had a scar near his left temple. She followed him outside, but he turned the corner and vanished into the crowd. 12 years had passed since Jonah vanished. The world outside had moved forward. New families had moved into the neighborhood where the Mills house once stood. The tree in the backyard had been cut down by new owners who did not know its significance. The swing set was long gone. The streetlights had been replaced, and the sidewalks were repaved. But for Elsie, time had never really moved on. Every year, on the anniversary of his disappearance, she returned to the old neighborhood. She parked a few blocks away and walked past their former house. She never stopped or stared too long. She just kept her pace steady, as if walking through a memory. On the 12th anniversary, she stood in front of the house longer than usual. The windows were dark. A for sale sign stood crooked in the front yard. The property looked abandoned. A thick layer of dust covered the front steps. For the first time in years, she felt an urge to go inside. She climbed the porch stairs and peered through the front window. The curtains were drawn back just enough for her to see the living room. It was empty, except for a chair in the corner. She walked around to the back of the house. The gate to the yard had fallen off its hinges. Weeds grew in clusters where grass once was trimmed. The tree was gone, but the stump remained. She knelt beside it and brushed away a layer of dirt. The roots had surfaced over time, gnarled and brittle. A jagged mark had been carved into the side of the stump. It looked like the symbol from Jonah's old drawings, the broken hourglass. Her hands began to tremble. She had not told anyone she was coming. She had not expected anything. But something about the carving felt deliberate. She pulled out her phone and snapped a picture. As she stood to leave, she noticed the back door had been left slightly ajar. The lock had rusted. The wood was splintering. Against her better judgment, she stepped inside. The air smelled like dust and mildew. The kitchen was stripped bare. Cabinets hung open and wallpaper peeled from the corners. She moved slowly through the space, her footsteps echoing on the warped floorboards. She climbed the stairs and reached what used to be Jonah's room. The door stuck slightly before creaking open. The room was empty except for a small pile of debris in the corner. Sunlight cut through the slats in the blinds. The floor had buckled near the window. As she turned to leave, her eye caught a glint under the old vent near the baseboard. She crouched down and pulled at the vent cover. Behind it, wedged between the wall and a loose panel, was Jonah's sketchbook. The cover was worn and the edges curled from moisture. She flipped through the pages. Some were filled with childish doodles, but others were more detailed. The last few pages were different. They were drawn in pencil, not crayon. One showed a room with shadows stretching across the floor. Another showed a window with a single eye drawn outside it. The final drawing stopped her cold. It was the tree in the backyard, but instead of leaves, the branches ended in hands reaching downward. She took the sketchbook and left the house without looking back. That night, she studied the drawings for hours. Each page seemed to tell a part of a story, one she had not understood as a child. The images were darker than she remembered Jonah ever drawing. She searched for any symbol or clue that connected to the man with the broken hourglass tattoo. She found it again on the sleeve of a jacket in one of the sketches. She searched online for hours, cross-referencing tattoos, symbols, and old cases. Finally, she came across a local forum post from 6 years ago. It mentioned a man arrested in 1991 for child endangerment. He had served time and was released under supervision. The post included a scanned image of his arrest record. In the corner of the page was a booking photo. The man had a tattoo on his left hand. It was a broken hourglass. Her chest tightened. She copied the name from the post and searched the state database. He had been released the year before Jonah disappeared. The timeline fit. Elsie printed the photo and brought it to the local precinct. She asked to speak with anyone still connected to her brother's case. Most of the original investigators had retired, but a younger officer agreed to listen. She explained what she had found and handed over the sketchbook and the printed image. He promised to follow up. A few days later, she received a phone call from a man who introduced himself as retired Officer Calvin Dean. He had been part of the original investigative team. He told her he had always believed something had been missed. He asked to meet in person. They sat at a small coffee shop and he pulled out an old notebook. He explained that back in 2011 they had received a tip from someone who refused to give a name. The caller had mentioned a man with a broken hourglass tattoo living near the Mills home. Dean had passed the tip to his supervisor, but nothing ever came of it. He believed the information had been suppressed. Maybe by mistake, maybe not. Elsie returned home and reopened every file she had compiled over the years. She felt both closer and more lost than ever. The sketches in Jonah's book suggested he had seen something, or someone. The man with the tattoo, the hidden door, the chair with the window. It had all been there. Clues buried in pictures no one had taken seriously. She thought of the clock with no hands, the drawings of windows and trees with human arms. They were messages left behind in the only language Jonah had known. She placed the drawings in chronological order and noticed a subtle progression. The early ones were filled with light, colorful, bright skies. But as the pages turned, the color faded. The figures shrank. The spaces grew darker. In the last image, there was no figure. Only a forest completely still with a single eye drawn in the sky. She stared at the image until her eyes ached. The eye seemed to be looking directly at her, watching, waiting. Officer Dean called again 2 weeks later. His voice was calm but urgent. He said he had located an address associated with the man who had the broken hourglass tattoo. His name was Douglas Rayner. After his release in 2010, Rayner had registered with the state under a housing assistance program and lived in a cabin near the edge of a state forest 40 miles north of Belden. Dean explained that although Rayner had moved several times, no one had tracked him after 2012. The registry had not updated his address for nearly a decade. Dean said it was possible the man had vanished off the grid, or he had been living under another name. Elsie took the news quietly. She thanked Dean and asked if she could see the place. He hesitated, but eventually agreed. They met on a rainy morning and drove out together. The road narrowed into gravel and disappeared into trees. The cabin stood a lone roof, sagging windows clouded. It looked abandoned. Vines crept up one side of the structure. Dean knocked on the door. No one answered. After several minutes, they circled around back. The door there had been forced open long ago. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with mildew and dust. Furniture had been overturned. Empty bottles and broken frames littered the floor. A rusted bed frame leaned against one wall, and in the corner, a stack of cardboard boxes had begun to disintegrate. Elsie moved slowly, her eyes scanning the walls. She found carvings near a window. Small scratch marks in uneven lines. Some formed circles. Others looked like symbols she had seen before in Jonah's drawings. She took pictures with her phone. Dean found a metal lockbox buried under a pile of blankets. Inside were yellowed newspapers, a map with several spots marked in red, and a leather-bound notebook. The notebook contained dates, locations, and a list of names. Elsie flipped through the pages until she found a familiar one. Jonah Mills. The entry beside it had only 2 words written in block letters, followed twice. Dean's hands trembled slightly as he took the notebook and sealed it in a bag. He told Elsie this could be enough to reopen the case officially. The following week, investigators searched the cabin and surrounding property. Cadaver dogs were brought in. Drones scanned the forest canopy. Dig teams worked long hours in the rain. Nothing was found that could prove Jonah had been held there. But the notebook changed everything. It confirmed that Jonah had been watched. It placed Rayner in proximity to the family in the weeks before Jonah disappeared. More names on the list were cross-checked. One of them matched a missing persons report from Pennsylvania in 2006. Another linked to a closed case in Ohio. The FBI was notified. Elsie was asked to stay silent while the investigation continued. She agreed, but the weight of it became unbearable. At night, she reread the notebook pages. The handwriting was jagged, inconsistent, as if Rayner had written under stress. Some pages were full of scribbles like a man unraveling. Others were exact. She found a passage describing a door beneath a tree. The entry was dated 1 week before Jonah vanished. It read, "He found the door again. I told him not to go back." Elsie printed the entire contents of the notebook and laid them out on her bedroom floor. She aligned them with her drawings, the photos from the old sketchbook, and the map from the lockbox. She noticed a pattern. The marked spots on the map followed a narrow corridor through several small towns. Belden was directly in the middle. One point was circled twice. It was near a river outside of Harrow, an hour east. She searched online and found that the location now hosted a set of rental cabins. She called the number listed and asked about historical records. The owner, a woman named Darlene, agreed to meet. Elsie drove out the next morning. Darlene was in her 70s and had inherited the cabins from her brother. She remembered Rayner. He had stayed there under a different name. He paid in cash and stayed for 3 months in 2011. She recalled him being polite but odd. He rarely spoke. Always wore gloves, even in summer. She also remembered he had been very protective of one particular shed behind his unit. Darlene gave permission for the shed to be searched. The current renters were informed and law enforcement arrived by evening. Inside the shed, they found storage bins, tools, and empty cans of food. In one corner, buried beneath tarp and plywood, was a small mattress and 2 plastic chairs. The walls were painted yellow. On one of the walls drawn in pencil was a picture of a house with a tree. The tree was marked with the same broken hourglass symbol. The drawing had initials in the corner. J.M. Elsie could not breathe when she saw it. She stepped outside and sat on the grass staring at the horizon. The evidence pointed to something chilling. Jonah had been there. The investigators took DNA samples from the mattress and other surfaces. They confirmed 2 distinct profiles. One matched Rayner. The other was still being tested. Elsie knew in her heart whose it was. She waited every day for the call. It came 2 weeks later. The voice on the other end simply said the second DNA sample matched her brother. Sarah sat with the phone in her lap for almost an hour. She did not speak, she did not cry. She simply looked out the window, the sunlight resting on her shoulders. Elsie sat beside her, the notebook resting on the table. The case had officially reopened. Rayner had not been found. No one had seen him in years. But the evidence placed Jonah in that shed. He had been alive for some time after he vanished. That truth was both devastating and redemptive. They had always feared the worst. Now they knew at least part of the story. Jonah had lived. He had drawn. He had tried to remember. Elsie gathered every piece of the puzzle into a binder. She labeled it The Path. It included sketches, dates, maps, and timelines. She gave a copy to the investigators and kept the original. She knew the case was far from over, but for the first time in 12 years she felt closer to her brother than ever before. The following month, the FBI launched a formal task force focused on reviewing cold cases connected to Rayner. His movements were now being tracked across 5 states and dozens of archived files were reopened. Elsie continued to assist as a civilian volunteer, supplying her notes, drawings, and all timelines she had built over the years. She was quiet but meticulous. She noticed that several locations from Rayner's map fell within walking distance of abandoned buildings or state-owned properties. One site stood out. It was near the riverbanks of an old town that had partially flooded years before. The remaining structures were now condemned. One building, listed as a defunct ranger outpost, had not been accessed since 2011. Its coordinates matched a location Rayner had circled 3 times in red ink. Elsie showed the map to the FBI liaison, who arranged for a ground search. The property had been overlooked for years due to changes in jurisdiction. A small team set out to investigate. The building had 2 floors, both filled with rotting wood mold and collapsed beams. But in the basement they found a door that had been painted to match the concrete wall. The hidden door had no knob. Instead, a metal latch had been installed from the inside. Investigators pried it open carefully. The room inside was barely 8 feet wide and 6 feet deep. There was no window. One light fixture hung from the ceiling. On the walls, more pencil sketches were taped in rows. Some had faded. Others were recent. One showed a hand reaching through bars. Another was a picture of a bird in a cage. On the floor were old food wrappers, an empty journal, and a single red sneaker. The serial number inside the shoe matched a pair that had been purchased for Jonah just weeks before he vanished. The agents photographed everything. DNA was collected from every object. A fingerprint lifted from the journal matched Rayner. No other prints were usable. One sketch was folded and taped to the back of the door. It showed a sun with a face smiling, and in the corner were the words, "I tried to be good." Elsie did not cry when she saw the photo of it. She felt hollow, as if the discovery had drained her of anything left to mourn. When Sarah was shown the images, she turned away. The red sneaker broke her. It had been a gift from her mother, one of the few things Jonah had ever received from his grandmother. She remembered him dancing in them the day they arrived, saying they made him faster than the wind. Now one of them sat in a basement like a ghost of motion. The discovery confirmed what Elsie had feared. Jonah had been held in more than one place. Rayner had moved him. The purpose remained unclear. There was no evidence of ransom, no communication, and no witnesses. The conditions of the room suggested a long-term stay, but no signs of Jonah remained. No blood, no remains, no sign of how or when he left. A forensic artist examined the drawings and determined they spanned several years. One sketch had the date 2016 written faintly in the corner. If accurate, that meant Jonah had survived for at least 5 years after being taken. Elsie focused on a single page torn from the journal found in the room. Most of the writing was childlike. Sentences were fragmented. One read, "I wake up and the birds do not sing here." Another said, "I drew my dream again. Let me go." The entries stopped abruptly. On the last page was a circle drawn in heavy strokes. Around it were 12 small shapes. They looked like stars or teeth. At the bottom were the initials JM. The drawings were sent to a forensic psychologist. He believed Jonah had been trying to preserve his identity through symbols and repetition. He wrote that the boy likely experienced prolonged isolation with limited access to daylight sound or movement. He described the sketches as survival expressions, a means to document time without clocks. When Elsie read the report, she thought about Jonah's old bedroom. She remembered how he used to talk to his toys, assigning them roles, giving them voices. She realized he had used those same skills to stay sane in captivity. He had survived in silence by creating worlds no one else could see. The search for Raynor intensified. Digital footprints were limited. He had not used bank accounts or identification in years. An old driver's license photo was circulated to local police departments. Tips began to come in from as far as Michigan. One lead placed him in a trailer park 6 years ago under the alias Daniel Rush. Another placed him working as a janitor at a supply warehouse. None were confirmed, but the FBI believed he had changed his appearance. A behavioral profile suggested he operated in isolated communities, avoided cities, and sought properties with little oversight. A new task force tracked down rental records, old employment files, and anyone who had interacted with him under assumed names. The investigation became a race against time. Raynor was aging, but he was still out there. He had left behind no known bodies. That fact gave the Mills family a strange kind of hope. Jonah could still be alive, lost, hidden, or free but afraid to return. Elsie placed every new sketch into her binder. The sun with the face, the teeth around the circle, the birds in the cage. She began to see a pattern, a sequence. Each symbol told a piece of Jonah's reality. She believed he had tried to leave a trail, not of where he was, but who he was becoming. A boy trying not to disappear completely. She started a new project recreating the drawings on larger canvases. Each one became a mural, not for display, but for preservation. She wanted the world to see what Jonah had lived through, to remember him as more than a case number. The drawings were not evidence anymore. They were proof of survival, and in them she found her brother's voice. Spring arrived with the kind of quiet warmth that used to remind Sarah of Jonah running barefoot across the grass chasing dandelion seeds. Now it simply passed without notice. Elsie spent most of her time traveling between meetings with investigators and locations on the map that Raynor had marked. One of the final locations, a closed hardware store on the edge of a river town, had not been searched before. She visited it with 2 FBI agents. The building was boarded up, windows dark, but the back door had a chain that had been cut recently. Inside, the walls were lined with shelves, still holding rusted tools. The basement had a single bulb hanging by a wire flickering. In the corner stood a workbench covered with old nails wrappers and a coffee mug etched with the name Doug. Elsie's eyes scanned the room. Her breath caught when she noticed a drawing pinned to the wall behind the bench. It was rough, done in pencil of a tree, with open hands growing from its branches. At the base of the tree, a small figure stood. The initials J.M. were etched at the bottom. She turned to the agents and asked for a moment alone. They stepped outside and she sat on the edge of the bench. The air smelled of oil and wood rot. She stared at the drawing, trying to memorize every line. Jonah had been here too. She wondered how long he had stayed, whether he had drawn in fear or in hope. It no longer mattered. Each drawing meant he had survived another day. She took out her phone and photographed the wall, then carefully removed the paper and placed it into a folder. As she stood to leave, something behind the workbench caught her eye. A flattened cereal box stuffed between two planks. She pulled it free and found a series of marks written in pen. The letters were uneven, as if made by someone who had not held a pen in years. One phrase repeated 4 times. "Please wait for me." She showed it to the agents. They collected it and promised to test for fingerprints. That night, Elsie could not sleep. She sat at her window and imagined her brother writing those words. A week later, Elsie was at a diner 2 towns over, waiting for her coffee. She had her folder open on the table, cross-referencing one of the locations listed in Rayner's notebook. A man walked in and sat 2 booths down. He looked about 50 gray in the beard-heavy coat despite the warm weather. He ordered without glancing at a menu. Elsie looked away, then back. Something about him felt familiar, his profile, his posture. She stared until he looked up. Their eyes met, and for a moment she could not breathe. The man blinked slowly, then looked down again. Elsie stood and approached his booth. She asked if he had ever lived near Belden. He said no. His voice was calm, but strained. She nodded and returned to her seat. She watched him finish his meal, leave a $5 bill, and walk out the door. She followed quietly. Outside, he turned left and crossed the parking lot. She watched him open the door to a white sedan with a cracked rear window. As the car pulled away, she caught the license plate. She wrote it down and called the agent assigned to her. Within hours, they traced the plate to a rental property registered under a false name. The property was located 30 minutes away. Agents arrived that night. The man was gone. The interior of the rental was empty except for a mattress and a cardboard box containing 2 drawings. Both had been folded neatly. One showed a doorway beneath tree roots. The other was of 2 children holding hands beneath a large sun. The initials were there again. J.M. The FBI believed the man had been Rayner. He had gotten too close. Maybe to check if they were closing in. Maybe for a reason only he knew. But his trail was thin. He had disappeared again this time, leaving no trace. The agents promised to keep searching, but Elsie felt a shift. She believed Rayner was not running from them. He had come to see something. Maybe her. Maybe what Jonah had left behind. Elsie began to receive letters. They arrived without return addresses. The handwriting was inconsistent. Some words were misspelled, but the tone was unmistakable. Each letter began with a phrase. "I saw you again." One described her walking out of the library. Another mentioned the scarf she wore near the river trail. At first, she gave them to the FBI. They fingerprinted and logged each one. But after the 4th letter arrived, Elsie read it more carefully. It ended with 3 lines. "I tried to draw. I remember your voice. I am sorry." She read those words over and over. The agents believed Rayner was sending the letters. But she felt otherwise. The handwriting looked too immature, too shaky. She compared it to the journal entries from the hidden room. The similarities were undeniable. She made copies and began comparing letters side by side. She started to believe that Jonah was alive, somewhere nearby, and he was trying to reach her in the only way he knew. She retraced every path he might have taken. She marked places where letters had been postmarked. A pattern emerged. The mail always came from within a 50-mile radius. She mapped the delivery times, cross-referenced with delivery routes, and found a consistent area of overlap. It led her to a small rural town, quiet and plain, with nothing but a church, a gas station, and a single grocery store. She drove there alone and sat in the lot of the post office for hours. On the second afternoon, just as the sun began to drop, she saw a boy no older than 17 walk across the street. He moved stiffly, his clothes too large. His hair fell across his face. He walked with his head down, but when he turned slightly, she saw his eyes. They were her eyes. Her breath caught. She opened the door and stepped out, calling his name. He stopped, but did not turn. Then he ran. She chased him halfway across the field behind the store, but he was gone before she reached the tree line. The last time Elsie saw the boy was under a pale gray sky. She returned to the small town 3 more times that week. Each time she walked the length of the post office, checked the alley behind the grocery store, and sat by the bus bench across from the church. No sign of him. She asked around, but no one remembered seeing a boy matching her description. Most people offered polite shrugs or tired eyes. The town was slow-moving and silent, the kind of place where the mail still mattered and the same radio station played from every corner. She kept a printed photo of Jonah in her coat pocket, the one taken just a month before he vanished. It was creased from handling. She never showed it to anyone. It was not for them. It was a reminder, a face tied to everything she had become. One morning, just after sunrise, she found another letter. It was tucked under her windshield wiper. The handwriting was rough. It said, "I was there. I saw you. You looked safe." She stood in the parking lot for a long time, holding the paper in both hands. It was not proof, not in any official way, but it was enough. She took the letter to the FBI field office. The agent in charge nodded without comment. They had reached a difficult point. Jonah was no longer a missing child. He was potentially a young adult living off-grid, possibly under trauma, possibly choosing to remain hidden. Unless he posed a threat or broke a law, they had no grounds to intervene. Elsie understood, but it did not make it easier. Her mother did not speak for nearly 2 days after Elsie shared the update. Sarah simply moved through the house like someone walking underwater. She began leaving her bedroom window open at night. She said it helped her breathe. In the following weeks, Elsie focused on her mural project. She transferred Jonah's final drawing onto a canvas 6 feet wide, the one with the sun and the 2 children. She painted, slowly, using only the colors found in his original sketches. She added detail to the figures' faces. She did not try to recreate him exactly. She let her memory fill in the space. The mural was not meant for galleries. It was meant for one pair of eyes. She placed it in the window of a downtown studio near a community park. She labeled it The Return. She left a message in the corner. It read, "I know you are still drawing." The studio owner agreed to keep it in place for a year. No questions asked. The mural caught attention quickly. People stopped to photograph it. Some asked about its meaning. Elsie never offered much explanation. The painting was not about what had happened. It was about what had not happened. The silence that followed a life paused in the middle of childhood. A few months later, Sarah received a letter. This time, it arrived by post, sealed in a plain envelope with no return address. Inside was a photograph. It showed a creek with a fallen tree and a boy standing ankle-deep in the water. The boy had his back turned. He wore a faded red hoodie and jeans. He was holding a notebook. The photo was slightly blurred, taken from a distance. On the back was a message. "I walk the woods. I remember the way home." Sarah held the photo for several minutes before passing it to Elsie. They sat at the kitchen table for the rest of the evening without speaking. Sarah eventually lit a candle and placed it beside the photo. The flame flickered softly, casting light across the worn surface of the table. It felt like a vigil. Not for death, but for waiting, for the space between lost and found. In the summer, Elsie received a call from a ranger station near the Appalachian Trail. A hiker had reported seeing a young man sleeping near one of the shelters. The description was vague. Tall, thin, possibly in his early 20s. He carried a sketchbook. He left before sunrise. The ranger provided a few notes and a location. Elsie made the trip the next day. She hiked 2 miles into the woods before reaching the shelter. It was empty, but the ashes of a small fire still remained. On the wooden bench inside, she found a symbol carved into the plank. It was a small circle with 12 dashes around it. The broken hourglass. She sat on the bench and placed her hand over the carving. It was recent. The wood was still rough. She closed her eyes and tried to listen. Birds moved in the trees. Wind passed through the leaves. Somewhere nearby, water flowed over rocks. The return was not dramatic. It did not come with lights or cameras. It happened in October on a cloudy morning. A car pulled into the driveway of Sarah's home. A boy stepped out. He was no longer a boy. He stood taller than Elsie remembered. His hair was longer. His eyes were cautious but clear. He carried no bag, only a small notebook in his hand. Sarah stepped onto the porch and froze. Elsie followed behind her. The young man looked at them both, then sat on the steps. He said nothing. He opened the notebook and placed it beside him. Then he looked up and waited. Sarah walked forward slowly and knelt beside him. She reached out and touched his face. He did not flinch. She began to cry, quietly the way people cry when the weight of years lets go all at once. Elsie sat beside them and did not speak. There was nothing left to ask. In the days that followed, no one pressed for explanations. Jonah spoke little. He moved carefully around the house, favoring corners and soft places. He ate slowly and often kept his eyes down, but he smiled once when he saw the mural. He touched the glass and traced the sun with his finger. Sarah began cooking again. Simple meals, familiar recipes. The smell of garlic and rosemary returned to the kitchen. The house filled with ordinary sounds. Water running. Chairs moving. Footsteps overhead. Jonah spent hours in the backyard. He sat on the steps with a pencil and paper. Some days he drew. Other days he just watched the sky. One afternoon he handed Elsie a sketch. It was a tree. The branches held open hands. Below, 2 figures stood side by side, one small, one grown. At the bottom he had written one word, here. The story did not end with full answers. Jonah never explained everything. He gave pieces, moments, a door with a latch, a cabin with yellow walls, a creek that sang at night, a woman who once gave him a coat, a man who disappeared one day and never returned. What mattered more was what came after. The healing, the walking forward, the quiet work of stitching a life back together. Elsie returned to school. She changed her major to art therapy. Sarah began volunteering with families of missing children. Jonah stayed close. He never strayed far. He did not need to. He was home. The return of Jonah Mills was not the end of a mystery. It was the beginning of a slow, sacred understanding. That sometimes survival is silent. That the human spirit can endure things that cannot be spoken. That love waits not always knowing how or when, but believing. The broken hourglass became a symbol not of time lost, but of time survived. A clock still ticking, a story still unfolding. In the hands of a boy who never stopped drawing, the world found its way back to light. If this story moved you, please take a moment to like and subscribe. Share your thoughts in the comments. We would love to know where you are watching from and what part of the story stayed with you most. Let me know if you'd like variations or a version for narration.